A broke janitor, drowning in debt, gambles his last $2,000 on a waterlogged garage everyone else ignored. What he discovered inside wasn't just junk. It was a secret that would rewrite his destiny. This is a story of how one desperate risk became a miracle. Before we dive into this unbelievable journey, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and turn on notifications. Stories like this remind us that hope is never truly lost. The last $2,000. The rain hammered against the windshield of Carlos Mendez's battered pickup truck. Each drop sounding like a ticking clock. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, his stomach twisting into knots. The numbers on his phone screen didn't lie. $2,147. That was it. The last of his savings. The last of everything. Outside, the abandoned garage stood like a gravestone in the middle of Rustboro's industrial wasteland. Its corrugated metal door was bent and rusted, half submerged in murky floodwater from last week's storm. The auction sign flapped in the wind, barely clinging to its post. Asterisk Lot 47. Storage garage. Content sold as is. Minimum bid, $2,000. Asterisk. Carlos exhaled sharply, his breath fogging up the glass. He shouldn't be here. He knew that. A 54-year-old janitor with nothing but aching knees and a mountain of medical debt had no business gambling his last dime on a waterlogged shed. But what other choice did he have? The school had cut his hours. The landlord had left an eviction notice on his door. And Maria, God, Maria. Even now, 2 years after cancer took her, the hospital bills still came. A voice crackled over the auctioneer's loudspeaker. We're moving to Lot 47. Do I hear $2,000? Carlos's pulse pounded in his ears. This was insanity. The garage was probably full of moldy boxes and broken furniture. But then again, what if it wasn't? He'd heard the rumors. Old man Higgins swore he'd seen a Vanderbilt heir stash something in there decades ago. The Vanderbilts had owned half the town before they vanished, leaving behind whispers of hidden money, lost deeds, and forgotten fortunes. Most people dismissed it as small-town legend. But what if $2,000 going once? Carlos's hand shot up before he could stop himself. Here! The auctioneer's eyebrows lifted. A few onlookers turned, their faces a mix of curiosity and pity. Nobody else had bid. Of course they hadn't. The place was a wreck. Sold to the gentleman in the blue shirt. The gavel slammed down, and just like that, Carlos was $2,000 poorer, and the owner of a flooded garage full of God knows what. The inside smelled like wet earth and rotting wood. Carlos's boots sloshed through ankle-deep water as he swept his flashlight beam across the wreckage. Crates slumped against the walls, their labels long faded. A rusted Chevy Nova sat in the corner, tires flat, windows fogged with grime. Great, just great. He kicked a soggy cardboard box, sending a family of cockroaches skittering. This was a mistake. A stupid, desperate mistake. Then, a glint of metal. Buried beneath a tarp was a small, dented safe, its surface pockmarked with rust. Carlos's breath hitched. He dragged it out, water sloshing from its seams. The lock was corroded, but still intact. His mind raced. Why would a safe be in a place like this? Who left it here? And, most importantly, what was inside? He grabbed a crowbar from the clutter and wedged it into the safe's door. The metal groaned in protest. Once. Twice. On the third try, the lock gave way with a screech. Carlos yanked the door open. No cash. No gold. Just a single yellowed envelope. Hands trembling, he peeled it open. Inside were 3 things. A faded blueprint of the town, marked with a red X beneath the old railroad tracks. A brittle newspaper clipping from 1963. Vanderbilt heir disappears. Family fortune still missing. A handwritten note, the ink bleeding from moisture. If found, deliver to L.V. Reward awaits. Carlos's heart slammed against his ribs. This wasn't just junk. This was a treasure map. The flooded mystery. The flickering beam of Carlos's flashlight danced across the damp concrete floor as he knelt beside the open safe. The air inside the garage was thick with the scent of mildew and rust, every breath tasting like old metal and wet earth. His fingers trembled as he carefully unfolded the brittle blueprint, its edges threatening to crumble at the slightest pressure. The paper was a relic, a detailed map of Rustboro from the 1960s, with streets and buildings long since changed or demolished. But what seized Carlos's attention was the bold red X mark near the old railroad tracks, just a few blocks from where he now stood. The handwriting beside it was barely legible, the ink smudged by time and moisture. Below the third pillar, only under the full moon. Carlos frowned. What did that mean? And who was LV? The initials had to stand for Lionel Vanderbilt, the last known heir to the family fortune before he vanished without a trace. The newspaper clipping in his hand confirmed it. A grainy photo of a sharp-faced man in a tailored suit, the headline screaming about lost wealth and unanswered questions. A sharp drip echoed from somewhere in the garage, making Carlos flinch. He wasn't alone. Or at least, it felt like he wasn't. Shoving the documents into his jacket pocket, he grabbed a crowbar and stood, scanning the shadows. The garage was silent, except for the occasional groan of shifting metal and the distant patter of rain on the roof. Still, his skin prickled with unease. Someone had left that safe here. Someone who expected it to be found. And if the Vanderbilts were involved, that meant money. Real money. Outside, the storm had worsened. Carlos hunched his shoulders against the downpour as he hurried to his truck, the documents pressed tightly against his chest beneath his jacket. His mind raced. If there was even a chance this lead was real, he couldn't waste time, but he also couldn't afford to be reckless. The third pillar. The full moon. He glanced at his phone. Tonight was a full moon. A coincidence? Or fate? His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since yesterday. He dug a crumpled dollar bill from his pocket and stared at it. Enough for a gas station coffee. Maybe a stale donut if he was lucky. He laughed bitterly. Here he was, holding what might be the key to a fortune, and he couldn't even afford a decent meal. The Rustboro Public Library was a crumbling brick building with flickering fluorescent lights and a faint smell of old paper. The librarian, a stern woman with cat-eye glasses, barely glanced up as Carlos hurried to the microfilm archives. He needed answers. An hour later, his eyes burned from squinting at the tiny text of decades-old newspapers. But he'd found it. A forgotten article from 1965, buried in the back pages of the Rustboro Gazette. Asterisk, local boy claims he saw a ghost near railroad tracks. It was carrying a big bag, says 12-year-old Tommy Haskins. Then it just disappeared. Asterisk, the article was mocked as childish fantasy, but one detail stood out. The boy had been near the third railroad pillar, the same one marked on the blueprint. Carlos's pulse quickened. Then another discovery. A follow-up article, 2 weeks later. Missing heir's car found abandoned near tracks. No sign of Lionel Vanderbilt, but police confirmed vehicle belonged to the wealthy family. A chill ran down Carlos's spine. This wasn't just about money anymore. Someone had disappeared. Night fell by the time Carlos reached the railroad tracks. The moon hung heavy and bright in the sky, casting long shadows across the rusted steel and rotting wooden beams. The third pillar was easy to spot, thicker than the others, its concrete base covered in decades of graffiti. Carlos knelt, running his hands over the cold surface. Nothing seemed unusual. No hidden compartments. No loose bricks. Had he misunderstood? Then his fingers brushed against something. A nearly invisible crack in the concrete. Too straight to be natural. He dug his nails into it, and with a grating sound, a small panel shifted. Behind it was a hollow space, and inside that space, a key, tarnished silver, with the initials LV engraved on the bow. Carlos barely had time to process the find when a twig snapped behind him. He spun around, hard in his throat. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, silhouetted by moonlight, watching him. Before Carlos could speak, the stranger turned and melted into the darkness, leaving only one question hanging in the cold night air. Who else was looking for the Vanderbilt fortune? The broken lock. The key burned a hole in Carlos's pocket as he drove back to town, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. Had that figure in the shadows been real, or just his exhaustion playing tricks on him? The roads were empty, the streetlights casting long, skeletal shadows across the asphalt. He needed a safe place to think. The only diner still open at this hour was Maggie's Spoon and Grill, a greasy spoon with flickering neon and vinyl booths that smelled like old coffee and bacon grease. Carlos slid into the corner booth, his back to the wall so he could watch the door. He ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a bowl of soup, and spread the damned documents across the table. The key glinted under the fluorescent lights. LV Lionel Vanderbilt. But where did it fit? The blueprint showed the railroad, but no buildings nearby. The note mentioned a reward. Was the key the first step to claiming it? His soup arrived, steam curling into the air. He barely tasted it. Then the bell above the diner door jingled. Carlos's head snapped up. A man in a long coat stood at the counter, his face hidden under a hat. He didn't order, didn't speak, just waited. Carlos's fingers tightened around the key. The man turned slightly, and Carlos caught a glimpse of a scar running down his jawline. No, not a coincidence. He'd seen that scar before. In the old newspaper photo of Lionel Vanderbilt's chauffeur, a man named Silas Graves. The article had mentioned Graves was questioned after Lionel's disappearance, but released due to lack of evidence. If Graves was here, decades later, that meant two things. The Vanderbilt mystery wasn't just a legend. Carlos wasn't the only one still searching. He waited until the man left before bolting for his truck. The key wasn't safe on him. Neither was he. Rain started again as he pulled up to his tiny apartment, a rundown studio above a laundromat. He took the stairs two at a time, locking the door behind him. The safe. He needed to get the safe out of the garage. But when he returned at dawn, the garage door was slightly ajar. Someone had been inside. Carlos's pulse roared in his ears as he stepped in, crowbar raised. The safe was still there, but the tarp was thrown back, the lock freshly scratched. They'd try to open it. He didn't have much time. The Rustboro Historical Society was housed in a converted Victorian with creaky floors and the scent of old books. The clerk, a college student with blue streaked hair, barely looked up from her phone as Carlos approached. "I need information on the Vanderbilts," he said, "specifically Lionel." She sighed. "You and every other treasure hunter." Carlos froze. "Others have asked?" "Last month, some guy offered me $50 for our Vanderbilt files." She leaned in. He had a creepy scar. "Silas Graves." Carlos swallowed hard. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. But," she lowered her voice, "check the Rustboro Ledger archives. Not the digital ones. The real ones. In the basement." The basement was a maze of filing cabinets and dust. Carlos found the ledger from November 1965 and nearly dropped it. A photo took up half the front page. Lionel Vanderbilt, standing beside the railroad tracks, gripping a leather satchel. The caption read, "Air insists it belongs underground before disappearance." And there, in the background, the third pillar. But it was the next article that turned Carlos's blood to ice. A follow-up 2 days later. Vanderbilt chauffeur alters story. Silas Graves now claims he never saw Lionel that night. A lie. And lies meant secrets. Carlos flipped another page and froze. A classified ad circled in faint pencil. "LV, if you find it, meet me at the usual place. Midnight. Bring the key." Dated the day Lionel vanished. Carlos's hands shook. This wasn't just about treasure. It was about a man who disappeared, and someone who'd helped make it happen. The town's secret. The classified ad burned in Carlos's mind like a lit fuse. Bring the key. Someone had been waiting for Lionel Vanderbilt that night. Someone who knew he wouldn't be coming back. Carlos needed to talk to someone who remembered. Someone who wouldn't lie. That meant Old Man Higgins. Higgins was Rustboro's unofficial historian, a grizzled Vietnam vet who ran the junkyard on the edge of town. Rumor was he'd been a teenager when Lionel vanished, and he'd never stopped digging into the mystery. The junkyard was a graveyard of rusted cars and forgotten machines, the air thick with the scent of oil and decay. Higgins sat on a busted lawn chair outside his trailer, a shotgun across his lap and a cigarette dangling from his lips. His eyes, sharp and clear despite his age, locked onto Carlos the moment he stepped out of his truck. "You're either real brave or real stupid, Mendez," Higgins rasped, asking about Vanderbilts in this town. Carlos didn't bother with small talk. He pulled out the key and the newspaper. What happened the night Lionel disappeared? Higgins exhaled smoke, his gaze flickering to the trees behind Carlos, like he expected someone to be listening. Lionel wasn't just rich. He was different, had ideas about giving land back to the town, cutting out the family's crooked partners. He tapped the ash off a cigarette. That kind of talk gets you buried. By who? Silas Graves, for one, drove for the Vanderbilts, but everyone knew he was really on the payroll of the railroad company. They stood to lose millions if Lionel's plans went through. Higgins leaned forward. But here's what no one prints. Lionel did hide something that night, and Silas has been looking for it ever since. Carlos's fingers tightened around the key. "Where?" Higgins smirked. "You already found the first clue, didn't you?" The third pillar. The full moon. Carlos waited until midnight, the key icy in his palm. The railroad tracks were eerily silent. The only sound the distant hoot of an owl. The moon cast everything in silver, turning the weeds into grasping fingers. He pressed the key against the pillar, running it along the cracks until, click, a hidden compartment slid open, revealing a narrow tunnel descending into blackness. Carlos's flashlight barely pierced the darkness. The air smelled of damp earth and something sharper. Oil? Metal? The tunnel opened into a cavern, its walls lined with crumbling brick. And in the center, a vault, not some rusty safe, a massive, steel bank vault, its door gleaming despite decades underground. Carlos's breath caught. This was no mere stash of cash. This was a fortune. He reached for the handle. Took you long enough. Carlos whirled. Silas Graves stepped from the shadows, his scar twisting as he smiled. In his hand, a revolver glinted. "I knew you'd come," Silas said. Higgins always did have a big mouth. Carlos's blood turned to ice. "You killed Lionel." Silas chuckled. "I just closed the door. He was the one who locked himself in." He nodded to the vault. "Go ahead. Open it." Carlos hesitated. This was a trap. But what choice did he have? With a grunt, he turned the vault wheel. The door swung open with a groan. Inside wasn't gold, wasn't money. It was a skeleton in a tattered suit, a leather satchel still clutched in its bony fingers. Lionel Vanderbilt. Silas's smile widened. "Now you see why no one ever found him." The underground discovery. The skeletal fingers of Lionel Vanderbilt seemed to twitch in the flickering beam of Carlos's flashlight. The leather satchel still clutched in its grasp like a final act of defiance. The air in the vault was thick with the scent of old earth and something fouler. Decay, preserved for decades in this sealed tomb. Silas Graves took a step forward, his revolver unwavering. "Go on," he sneered. "Take it. That's what you came for, isn't it?" Carlos's mouth went dry. This wasn't treasure hunting anymore. This was standing in a murderer's secret grave. He forced himself to move, his fingers brushing against the brittle leather of the satchel. As he pried it loose from Lionel's grip, a small cascade of bones clattered to the vault floor. The sound made his stomach lurch. Silas chuckled. "He fought like hell when we locked him in. Screamed for hours. Funny thing is, nobody heard him down here." He tapped the vault door with the barrel of his gun. Soundproof. Meant for gold, but it worked just as well for keeping a man quiet. Carlos's hands trembled as he unbuckled the satchel. Inside were three things. A deed to the Vanderbilt land, and signed but bearing the family seal. A letter, yellowed with age, addressed to the townspeople of Rustboro. A small, velvet pouch heavy with something metallic. He didn't have time to examine them. Silas's patience was wearing thin. "Hand it over," Silas demanded, gesturing with the gun. Carlos hesitated. If he gave up the satchel, Silas would kill him just like he'd killed Lionel. If he ran, he'd be shot in the back before he made it 3 steps. Then he remembered the flashlight in his other hand. In one swift motion, Carlos hurled it at Silas's face and ducked as the gun roared. The bullet ricocheted off the vault door with a deafening ping. In the sudden darkness, Carlos lunged to the tunnel entrance. Silas bellowed in rage. A second shot exploded, this one tearing through Carlos's jacket sleeve as he scrambled into the narrow passage. The tunnel was pitch black, the walls closing around him as he ran blindly. One hand braced against a damp brick to keep from slamming into turns. Behind him, Silas's curses echoed like a demon in pursuit. Carlos's foot caught on something, a loose stone, a root, and he went down hard, the satchel flying from his grip. He groped frantically in the dark, his fingers closing around the strap just as a flashlight beam cut through the blackness. Silas stood at the bend in the tunnel, panting, his scarred face twisted in fury. "You're dead, Mendez." Carlos did the only thing he could think of. He kicked out at the tunnel wall, where the bricks looked weakest. A section crumbled instantly, showering dirt and debris. Then, with a groan, the ceiling gave way. Silas barely had time to shout before a cascade of earth buried him alive. Carlos didn't wait to see if he'd dig himself out. He ran. The night air had never tasted sweeter. Carlos collapsed at the base of the railroad tracks, gasping, the satchel still clutched in his arms. He was alive, but for how long? He unrolled the letter first, squinting under the moonlight. Lionel's handwriting was elegant but frantic. "If you're reading this, they've killed me. The land was never theirs. It belongs to Rustboro. The deed proves it. The pouch holds the key to the trust. Find my sister. She'll know what to do." Carlos appended the velvet pouch into his palm. A single gold key slid out, this one stamped with a serial number, a safe deposit box. Somewhere in Rustboro, there was a lock that fit this key, and whatever was inside it could change everything. But first, he had to find Lionel's sister, and hope Silas Graves was still underground. The sister's secret. The morning sun painted Rustboro in pale gold as Carlos stood outside the Ironwood nursing home, the velvet pouch heavy in his pocket. According to Higgins, Eleanor Vanderbilt, Lionel's younger sister, had been committed here in 1972, just 7 years after her brother's disappearance. Declared insane, Higgins had muttered, "Convenient, ain't it?" The lobby smelled like antiseptic and overcooked peas. A bored receptionist barely glanced up as Carlos signed the visitor log under a fake name. Eleanor Vanderbilt? The woman sighed. "Room 317. Don't expect much. She hasn't spoken in decades." The hallway seemed to stretch forever, the squeak of Carlos's shoes echoing like whispers. When he reached room 317, he paused. Through the half-open door, he saw an old woman in a wheelchair by the window, her silver hair thin but carefully brushed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Carlos knocked softly. Eleanor didn't turn. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Miss Vanderbilt? I found something of your brother's." Silence. Then, "So quiet, he almost missed it. Took you long enough." Carlos's pulse jumped. Eleanor's voice was cracked with age, but her words were sharp. She turned slowly, and her eyes, pale blue, like faded denim, locked onto his. "You're the janitor," she said, "the one who bought the garage." Carlos's mouth went dry. "How did you—" "They still tell me things," she interrupted, "thinking I don't matter, that I don't remember." Her fingers tightened on the arms of her wheelchair. "But I remember everything." Carlos pulled out the gold key. "Lionel left this. He said you'd know what to do." Eleanor's breath hitched. For a moment, Carlos thought she might cry. Instead, she laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Oh, Lionel, still trying to save the world from beyond the grave." She wheeled herself to the bedside table and yanked open the drawer. Inside was a yellowed envelope. She tossed it to Carlos. "First National Bank. Safe Deposit Box 214. Her smile was razor thin. "The key fits there." Carlos unfolded the envelope. A newspaper clipping fluttered out. A headline from 1965. "Vanderbilt Railroad shares voided after legal battle." Eleanor's voice turned icy. Lionel was going to give the railroad back to the town. That's why they killed him. But he hid the real shares, the ones that proved the land was stolen. Carlos's mind raced. If those shares still held value. The bank closed in '78. Eleanor continued. But the vault's still there. Basement of the old building on Main. She met his eyes. You'll need this, too. From under her pillow, she pulled a second key, this one rusted and larger. Back door, she said simply. Carlos took it, his fingers brushing hers. Her skin was paper-thin, but her grip was firm. Be careful, she whispered. They're still watching. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Carlos froze. Through the door's narrow window, a shadow moved. Eleanor's face went blank again, her gaze dropping to her lap. Time for my medicine, she said loudly, her voice suddenly vacant. The door swung open. A nurse stood there, her smile too bright. Visiting hours are over, mister. Carlos pocketed the keys. Smith. The nurse's eyes flicked to Eleanor, then back to him. Of course. Let me walk you out. As Carlos followed her down the hall, he glanced back. Eleanor was staring after him, her lips moving silently. 2 words. Run. Now. The bank vault. The old First National Bank building loomed over Main Street like a tombstone, its once grand columns now chipped and stained by decades of neglect. Carlos circled the block twice, watching for movement in the darkened windows. The nurse had been too eager to score him out, too interested. Someone was on to him. He waited until a passing police car turned the corner before slipping into the alley. Eleanor's rusted key fit smoothly into the back door's lock. The mechanism groaned in protest, but the door swung open with a nudge, exhaling a breath of stale, dusty air. Inside, the bank was frozen in time. Cobwebs draped over teller stations, and faded posters from the 1970s still clung to walls, advertising savings accounts with 5% interest. Carlos's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a staircase leading down. The basement. His footsteps echoed as he descended, the wooden stairs creaking under his weight. The air grew colder, damper. At the bottom, a massive steel door stood sentinel, its surface pockmarked with rust but still imposing. Safe deposit vault. Carlos pulled out the gold key, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then a sound behind him, a scrape of metal on concrete. He spun, crowbar raised, but the shadows were still, just the building settling. Shaking off the unease, he approached the vault. The gold key slid into the lock with a satisfying click. He turned it, then hesitated. Eleanor's warning echoed in his mind. They're still watching. With a deep breath, he pulled the vault door open. Inside, rows of safe deposit boxes lined the walls, their tiny doors identical except for the numbers stamped on each. Box 214 was at eye level, tucked between 213 and 215, like it had been waiting for him. The second key fit perfectly. The box slid out with a whisper. Inside lay 3 items. A stack of stock certificates, Vanderbilt Railroad shares, signed and dated. A faded photograph of Lionel and Eleanor standing with a group of railroad workers, their faces grim. A letter, sealed in an envelope marked to the finder. Carlos tore it open. If you're reading this, the shares are yours to claim. They control 51% of the railroad, enough to dissolve the company or rebuild it as the town sees fit. But be warned, the men who kill me will kill you too. Trust no one, not even the law. Carlos's hands trembled. This wasn't just a fortune, it was power. Power to undo decades of corruption. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Then another. Someone was here. Carlos shoved the contents of the box into his jacket and killed his flashlight, plunging the vault into darkness. Heavy footsteps moved above him, deliberate, searching. Silas? The nurse? Someone else? He edged along the wall, feeling his way toward the staircase. A beam of light suddenly sliced through the darkness from above, sweeping the basement. Carlos ducked behind a filing cabinet, holding his breath. The footsteps descended. 1 stair. 2. Then, a voice low and familiar. I know you're down here, Mendez. Higgins. But the old man's tone was all wrong, cold, calculating. Not the gruff ally Carlos remembered. Eleanor talked. Higgins continued, stepping off the stairs. A pistol gleamed in his hand. Should have known she'd crack after all these years. Carlos's blood turned to ice. Higgins had been part of it the whole time. The beam of Higgins' flashlight inched closer, illuminating the dusty floor. Carlos tightened his grip on the crowbar. He had one chance. As the light brushed his shoe, he lunged. The Judas of Rustboro. Carlos swung the crowbar with every ounce of strength he had. The metal connected with Higgins's wrist, sending the pistol clattering across the concrete floor. The old man howled in pain but recovered frighteningly fast, tackling Carlos into a shelf of safety deposit boxes. Rusty metal doors dug into Carlos's back as they grappled, Higgins's breath hot and sour against his face. "You stupid bastard," Higgins snarled, his grizzled face twisted into something monstrous in the dim light. "You think a few papers change anything? The Vanderbilts are dead. This town belongs to the railroad now." Carlos kneed him in the gut, breaking free. He dove for the gun, but Higgins was quicker, snatching it up and leveling it at Carlos's chest. The barrel looked like a bottomless pit. Higgins's finger tightened on the trigger. Click. The gun jammed. For a split second, disbelief flickered across Higgins's face. That was all Carlos needed. He lunged again, this time driving Higgins backward into the vault door. The impact knocked the air from the old man's lungs. The gun skittered away, disappearing into the shadows. Higgins gasped, clutching his ribs. "You don't understand. The railroad owns this town. The cops, the mayor, even the damn nurses." His lips peeled back in a bloody grin. "You'll never make it out of here alive." Carlos didn't waste time answering. He grabbed the stock certificates from where they'd fallen and bolted up the stairs. Higgins's labored breathing and curses fading behind him. The alley was still empty when he burst outside, but sirens wailed in the distance. Too close. Higgins wasn't bluffing about the cops being in his pocket. Carlos ran. The abandoned textile mill on the edge of town had been his hiding spot as a kid. Now, with the morning sun bleeding through broken windows, it served as a sanctuary. He barricaded the office door behind him and finally let himself breathe. The stock certificates were pristine despite decades in the vault, signed, notarized, and utterly damning. Proof that the Vanderbilt family had never legally sold their controlling share of the railroad, which meant every deal since Lionel's murder was built on a lie. But how could a janitor with no money, no lawyer, and a target on his back expose something this big? The photograph from the safe deposit box fluttered to the floor. Carlos picked it up, studying the faces. Lionel and Eleanor stood front and center, but it was the workers behind them that caught his eye. One man, tall with a distinctive birthmark across his cheek, wore a cap with Local 46 stitched on the brim, the Railroad Workers Union. A memory clicked. Old man Higgins's junkyard was stacked with old union newsletters, including maybe names. Carlos was out the door before the thought fully formed. Higgins's junkyard was eerily quiet, the shotgun still propped against the trailer door where the old man always kept it. Carlos crept past snarling guard dogs, who knew him well enough not to bark, and into the trailer's back room. Higgins's archive. Dusty boxes of paperwork filled every inch of space. It took an hour of frantic searching, but he found it. Asterisk Brotherhood of Railroad Workers, Local 46, Member Directory, 1965. Asterisk. The man with the birthmark was listed on page 3. Patrick O'Leary. Foreman, retired in 1982. And beneath that, an address. Carlos was halfway to his truck when the trailer door creaked open behind him. Higgins stood there, pale as a ghost, one arm clutched around his ribs. Blood seeped through his shirt where Carlos had slammed him into the vault. But it was the look in his eyes that froze Carlos in place, not anger, fear. "You don't want to talk to O'Leary," Higgins rasped. "That man's the reason Lionel's body was never found." Carlos tightened his grip on the directory. "Then he's exactly who I need." Higgins swayed, suddenly looking every one of his 80 years. "You'll get us both killed." A drop of blood hit the dirt between them. Carlos made his choice. He left Higgins standing there and drove toward the truth. The foreman's truth. Patrick O'Leary's house was a crumbling bungalow at the end of a dirt road, its porch sagging under the weight of decades. The man who answered the door was a skeleton of the robust foreman in the photograph. His birthmark now stretched across paper-thin skin, his eyes milky with cataracts. But when Carlos showed him the stock certificates, those eyes sharpened with terrifying clarity. You. O'Leary's voice was a dry rasp. He grabbed Carlos's wrist with surprising strength. I've been waiting for you. The inside of the house smelled like mothballs and whiskey. Newspaper clippings about the railroad covered every surface, connected by strings like some detective's conspiracy board. O'Leary didn't sit. He paced, his slippers shuffling against cracked linoleum. Lionel was going to give us the railroad, he said. Not the company. The workers. Shares, pensions, the whole damn thing. His knuckles whitened around a yellowed photograph. The same one Carlos had found, but this one was torn, half the face is missing. Silas Graves put a bullet in him for it. Carlos's stomach dropped. You saw it happen? O'Leary's laugh was bitter. Saw? I helped bury him. He yanked open a drawer, pulling out a rusted railroad spike. This was in Lionel's hand when we found him. He clawed at the vault door until his fingers broke. The spike was dark with old blood. Carlos swallowed bile. Why tell me this now? Because the shares ain't enough. O'Leary tossed McKeering dozens of identical keys, each numbered, safety deposit boxes. Every foreman got one. Mine's got the real proof. Time card showing Silas was at the tracks that night. Payroll records proving the company paid him to disappear Lionel. He wheezed a cough. But the boxes are at the rail yard, and that place is crawling with Graves' men. A clock chimed somewhere in the house. O'Leary's face went slack. They're coming, he whispered. Carlos heard it too, engines rumbling up the dirt road. O'Leary shoved him toward the back door. Go. Now. But the proof. Box 12. O'Leary hissed. Then louder, I ain't talking to no reporters. He winked. A quick, desperate gesture as the front door burst open. Carlos barely made it out as voices shouted inside. He crouched behind a rusted pickup, watching through the window as two men in railroad uniforms dragged O'Leary to his knees. One pulled a pistol. Carlos turned away before the shot rang out. The rail yard was a maze of freight cars and diesel fumes. Carlos kept low, moving between shadows. Box 12 was in a foreman's shack, a tiny building sandwiched between warehouses. He picked the lock in seconds. Inside, the safety deposit box was tucked under a floorboard. The contents were sparse but damning. Silas's time card from November 3rd, 1965. The night Lionel vanished, stamped on duty at the tracks. A canceled check from the railroad company to Silas Graves, dated 2 days later, for $10,000. A blood-stained handkerchief with LV embroidered in the corner. Footsteps crunched gravel outside. Carlos stuffed the evidence into a jacket just as the door flew open. Silas Graves stood there, his scarred face twisted in a smile. In his hand, O'Leary's railroad spike gleamed. Funny, Silas said. I was just coming to clean out that box myself. The reckoning. The railroad spike in Silas Graves' hand glinted under the flickering warehouse light, its tip still stained with the rust of decades-old blood. Carlos backed against the wall, his fingers brushing the evidence stuffed inside his jacket. The proof that could destroy Silas and the corrupt empire he protected for 50 years. You should have walked away when you had the chance, Silas said, rolling the spike between his fingers like a butcher choosing his knife. Now you'll end up just like Lionel, just like O'Leary. Carlos's pulse roared in his ears, but he forced himself to stand straighter. Difference is, Lionel died alone. I won't. Silas lunged. Carlos ducked, grabbing a rusted pipe from the floor and swinging it wildly. Metal clanged against metal as the spike deflected off the pipe, sending sparks flying. Silas was stronger, but age had slowed him. Carlos feinted left, then swung right. The pipe connected with Silas's ribs with a sickening crack. The old killer staggered, but didn't go down. He grinned, blood staining his teeth. You hit like a janitor. Then the warehouse door burst open. Higgins stood there, shotgun leveled at Silas's chest. His face was pale, his breathing ragged from the wound Carlos had given him earlier, but his hands were steady. Enough, Higgins growled. Silas laughed. You? After all these years, you grow a conscience? Higgins's finger tightened on the trigger. I grew tired. The shotgun blast tore through the silence. Silas jerked backward, his chest a ruin of red. He collapsed onto concrete, the railroad spike rolling from his lifeless fingers. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Higgins lowered the gun. "The shares," he rasped. "You still got him?" Carlos nodded. "Wary. Good." Higgins tossed him a set of car keys. "There's a reporter at the Chicago Tribune, waiting for your call. Name's Rebecca Cho. She's been digging into railroad corruption for years." He wiped blood from his mouth. "Go, before more Graves' men show up." Carlos hesitated. "Why help me now?" Higgins's smile was bitter. "Because I buried 2 good men for this company. I ain't burying a third." The story made national headlines. Decades-old murder uncovered. Railroad tycoon's death tied to corporate conspiracy. With the shares and evidence Carlos provided, the Vanderbilt fortune was reclaimed, not for personal gain, but to fund the restoration of Rustboro. The railroad company collapsed under lawsuits, its corrupt leadership dismantled. Eleanor Vanderbilt was moved to a proper care facility, where she spent her final days in peace, watching the town her brother loved finally heal. As for Carlos, he stood on the steps of the old high school where he'd once mopped floors, now holding a very different set of keys, the ones to the new community center, built in the restored garage where his journey began. The crowd cheered as he cut the ribbon, and for the first time in years, Carlos Mendez smiled. This story proves that even the darkest secrets can't stay buried forever. If you believe in second chances and the power of truth, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs hope, and subscribe for more real-life tales of courage. Because sometimes the most ordinary people change the world.